The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late October, when the leaves had already gone brown and nobody had gotten around to raking them yet. I was in the middle of pricing out a kitchen backsplash order at work when my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Is this Neil? The man on the other end had a steady voice, the kind that belonged to someone who worked with his hands and didn't waste words. This is Bud Keller. I'm the plumber your aunt hired to winterize the house on Sycamore. He paused and I could hear him choosing his next words carefully. I found something here you're going to want to see. I'd appreciate it if you could come out today if you're able. Another pause. And if you could come by yourself, I think that'd be best. I asked him what he meant. Just come alone, he said. I'll show you when you get here. My aunt had been gone for 11 weeks. She died in August, a Tuesday, at 74, in the house she had lived in alone for the last 19 years. Her neighbor had checked on her after not seeing her car move for 2 days. The medical examiner said it was a stroke, probably quick. My mother, who was her younger sister, and the only family my aunt had left nearby, took it hard in the way she took most things. Quietly, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, not saying much. I drove the 35 minutes to Millhaven with the radio on low, and my mind doing the thing it does when something has shifted but you can't yet tell how badly. My aunt's house was a small craftsman bungalow on the east side of town, the kind of street where most of the houses still had their original windows, and the sidewalks buckled from tree roots. She had bought it after her divorce, and spent 20 years making it exactly the way she wanted it, which meant books on every horizontal surface, a vegetable garden along the back fence that was the envy of her neighbors, and a workshop in the basement where she did woodworking on weekends. She had never remarried. She had no children. In her will, she had left the house to my mother, who was already talking about selling it once we had cleared it out. My cousin Brenda from Phoenix had offered to fly in and help, but that was still 2 weeks away. In the meantime, I had been the one making trips, handling the utilities, meeting the contractors, doing what needed doing. Bud Keller was waiting on the front porch when I pulled up. He was a compact man in his 60s with a gray mustache and work boots that had seen 20 winters. He shook my hand with the kind of grip that told me he hadn't been comfortable inside alone and was relieved I'd come quickly. "Appreciate you making the trip," he said, and pushed open the front door. We went through the living room, past the bookshelves my aunt had built herself, past the wingback chair where she used to read in the evenings, down the hall to the basement door. The workshop was in the back half of the basement. My aunt had set it up properly, a good workbench, a pegboard for her tools, a shop light on an adjustable arm. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil had settled into the concrete block walls over years. Bud pointed to the far corner, behind the water heater. There was a section of the paneling that didn't sit flush. You wouldn't have noticed it unless you were crouched down running a pipe alongside the wall the way he had been. The panel was about 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, set into the framing with small barrel bolts at the top and bottom that had been painted over so many times they blended in. A person had to know what they were looking at. "I've done plumbing work in a lot of old houses," Bud said. He was standing back, arms crossed, giving me room. "People hide things. Usually it's nothing much." He looked at the panel. "I didn't open it. That's not my place." I crouched down and turned the bolts. They moved stiffly, but they moved. The panel swung out on hinges my aunt had mortised cleanly into the framing. She had built this herself. I was certain of it the moment I saw the hinges. That was her work. Clean, measured, nothing showy about it. Behind the panel was a space roughly the size of a large suitcase. On a low wooden shelf my aunt had built to fit the space exactly, there were 3 things: a metal cash box, the fireproof kind you can buy at any hardware store, dark gray with a key lock, a 3-ring binder, thick, the spine labeled in her handwriting with a single word, reference, and a legal-sized envelope, sealed, with my mother's name written on the front in my aunt's careful angular script. I sat back on my heels and looked at all 3 of them for a long moment. Behind me I heard Bud shift his weight. "I'll go check the upstairs shut-off," he said quietly. "Take your time." I heard his boots on the stairs. I was alone in the basement with whatever my aunt had left. I took the envelope with my mother's name and set it aside. That wasn't mine to open. I opened the cash box first because I didn't have the key and the lock was the simple kind. I used a flathead from my aunt's pegboard and it took about 4 minutes. Inside there was $11,400 in cash, in mixed bills, rubber-banded into groups of 500. A handwritten note on an index card on top of the money said, "For the garden. You'll know what I mean." My mother had always talked about building raised beds in her backyard. It had been a thing between the two of them for years. My aunt kept saying she'd come down and help build them. My mother kept saying there was no rush. There was a rush now, and there wasn't, depending on how you looked at it. I opened the binder. It took me 2 hours to go through it. I sat on the concrete floor of my aunt's workshop, with the shop light on, and went through it page by page, and by the time I was done, I had a feeling in my chest that I didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't grief exactly, though. That was part of it. It was something closer to the feeling of realizing that a person you thought you knew had a whole interior life that was wider and more complicated than you'd understood. My aunt had worked for 31 years as a paralegal at a regional law firm in Millivan, Carruthers and Slade, family law and estate planning mostly, the kind of firm that had been in the same building downtown since before I was born. She had retired 4 years ago when the firm was absorbed into a larger practice out of Columbus, and half the staff was let go. She had been given a standard severance and a small retirement party in the conference room, and that was that. What the binder contained was a record she had kept over the last 12 years of her employment there. She had been meticulous about it, the way she was meticulous about it Ifring. There were printed emails, annotated, photocopied documents, a running ledger of dates, names, and what she described in her own shorthand as irregularities. Post-it notes in the margins with references to statutes and case numbers she had clearly looked up on her own time. What it added up to was this: a senior partner at the firm, a man named Clifford Grout, who had been practicing in Millhaven since the early 90s, had over a period of at least a decade been systematically skimming from client estate accounts. Not large amounts from any single account, small percentages, the kind of adjustments that could be attributed to clerical error or rounding if anyone looked at them individually. But my aunt had looked at them collectively. She had built a spreadsheet. The total, by her calculation, was somewhere above $200,000 spread across at least 40 client files, most of them elderly clients who had since died and whose families had never known to question the final accounting. She had documented when she first noticed. She had documented the 3 times she had raised concerns, once verbally to the firm's office manager, twice in writing and emails that she had printed and saved. She had documented that she received no meaningful response to any of them. She had documented that after her second written complaint, her annual review that year had rated her performance as needs improvement for the first time in 26 years of reviews. At the back of the binder, behind a tabbed section she had labeled Next Steps, there was a 2-page letter she had written addressed to the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct. The letter was dated 14 months before she died. It was not mailed. In the margin at the top of the first page, in pencil, she had written a single line: "Not yet. Wait until I'm sure." She had been waiting until she was sure when she had the stroke. I closed the binder. I sat in the quiet of the basement and listened to the water heater kick on. Upstairs I could hear Bud moving around, doing his work, leaving me alone with mine. I thought about my aunt the way I had known her. She came to every Thanksgiving. She remembered every birthday without being reminded. When my wife and I went through a difficult stretch in our marriage about 6 years ago, the kind of stretch where you're not sure what's on the other side of it, my aunt was the one who called me on a Wednesday night, out of nowhere, and talked to me for 2 hours. She never told me what to do. She just listened and asked questions that helped me think more clearly. She was like that. She was also the woman who had sat in a law office for 31 years and watched something wrong happen quietly and carefully built a record of it, because she believed in documentation, even when she wasn't sure what to do with it yet. I thought about the letter that had never been mailed. Not yet. Wait until I'm sure. She had been 74 years old. She had been waiting until she was sure. I drove home with the binder on the passenger seat and the cash box in the trunk, and the sealed envelope from my mother tucked carefully in my jacket pocket. I didn't open that one. It wasn't mine. I gave my mother the envelope that evening. I drove to her house, sat at the kitchen table, and put it in front of her. She looked at the handwriting on the front and was quiet for a moment, and then she opened it slowly, the way a person opens something they're not fully prepared for. I didn't read it. My mother read it privately in the living room, while I sat in the kitchen and looked at the backyard through the window. When she came back, her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. She said her sister had written about the garden, about the cash, about being sorry she hadn't come down yet to help build the raised beds, about hoping my mother would still build them and think of her when she did. At the end of the letter, my mother said her sister had written, "There's a binder in the workshop. Give it to Neil. He'll know what to do with it. He's always been better at the hard things than he thinks he is." I sat with that for a while. I called an attorney the following week, not a local one. I drove to Columbus and found a firm that handled professional misconduct in estate recovery cases. I made an appointment with a woman who had been practicing in that area for 20 years, and who had, based on the reviews I read and the phone call I had with her assistant, a reputation for not being impressed by people who thought they were untouchable. I brought her the binder. She sat across the desk from me and went through it for 40 minutes without saying anything, and when she finished, she looked up and said, my aunt had been an extraordinary paralegal. She said it the way someone says something when they mean it, and don't feel the need to add anything to it. What followed was not fast. I won't pretend otherwise. It took the better part of a year before the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Professional Conduct completed its initial investigation. There were months when I heard nothing and had to remind myself that slow was not the same as stopped. My cousin Brenda, once she understood what was in the binder, flew back out from Phoenix twice to sit with my mother and me while we went over updates from the attorney. My mother was calm throughout in the way my aunt had been calm. Not unfeeling, just steady. She said she wasn't surprised. She said she always knew her sister had been carrying something she hadn't talked about. She never said anything to me, my mother said one evening at her kitchen table. Not once in all those years. She didn't want you to worry about something she couldn't fix yet, I said. My mother nodded and looked at her coffee cup. That's her exactly, she said. Clifford Grout surrendered his law license 18 months after I brought the binder to the attorney in Columbus. He did not admit to wrongdoing in the terms of the agreement, which my attorney had told me from the beginning was the likely outcome and which was genuinely unsatisfying. A restitution process was opened for the estates of the affected clients, a process that was complicated and slow and that I was told was ongoing. What I was able to control, I controlled. The attorney's fees were covered by a contingency arrangement. The outcome wasn't the clean, arrived in one moment justice you hope for, but Clifford Grout no longer had a law license. That was real. My mother built the raised beds in the spring, about 7 months after my aunt died. I drove down on a Saturday in April and helped her put them together. 4 of them, 12 feet by 4, made from cedar boards that my mother had priced out carefully the same way her sister would have. We used the cash from the box to the dollar. We planted tomatoes, squash, and herbs. It was a warm day, the kind of early spring day in Ohio that feels borrowed, like it belongs to a different month but wandered in. We worked for most of the morning. My mother wasn't much of a talker when she was doing something that mattered to her. We put the plants in the ground and watered them in, and then stood back and looked at what we'd built. My mother said she should have come down to do this with me. I didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything useful to say. Then my mother said she was here anyway, and went inside to wash her hands. My aunt's house sold in June to a young couple who were fixing it up themselves, which I think she would have liked. I went over one last time before the closing, walked through the rooms, stood in the workshop in the basement. Bud Keller had finished his winterization work months ago. The hidden panel in the corner was still there, hinged open now, the shelf inside empty. I looked at it for a while. I thought about my aunt in that basement in the evenings, measuring and fitting and joining things together with care, building a record, building a shelf to hold it, building a whole careful argument for something she believed needed to be said and hadn't found the right moment for yet. She trusted me with it. I'm not sure I deserved that trust, but I tried to honor it the way she would have wanted, methodically, without making promises I couldn't keep, without letting the slow part stop me. The day the Board of Professional Conduct issued its final ruling, I drove out to the cemetery on the west side of Millhaven where she was buried. It was a gray November morning, the kind where the sky sits low and the air smells like wet leaves. I stood at her grave for a while, not sure exactly what I wanted to say. I said out loud because it felt like it deserved to be said out loud. I used it. The wind came through the trees along the fence. Somewhere down the road a school bus went by, kids loud inside it, the sound fading. I thought about the index card in the cash box. For the garden, you'll know what I mean. She knew I would figure it out. She had been right about that. She had been right about most things, my aunt. Steady and quiet and precise, the kind of person who does her best work in rooms nobody else is watching. I only wish I had known while she was still here how much she had been holding, for how long and what it had cost her to hold it so carefully. I still think about the index card. For the garden, you'll know what I mean. 11 words on a 3x5 card, tucked on top of $11,400 in a fireproof box behind a hidden panel my aunt had built with her own hands. That's how she operated. No drama, no explanation beyond what was necessary. She trusted that the right person would find it and understand it, and she was patient enough to wait, even if waiting meant she might not be there to see what happened next. That's the part I keep turning over. She had been carrying this for years, a $200,000 fraud. 40 elderly clients who never knew. A letter to the Board of Professional Conduct she had written, revised, and then set aside because she wasn't sure yet, not because she was afraid, because she was afraid. There's a difference, and my aunt understood that difference better than most people I've ever met. What she did, building that binder, documenting every date and every name and every non-response to her complaints, that was a moral act. It cost her something. That needs improvement to review after 26 years of clean evaluations. The knowledge that she had raised the issue and been ignored. Most people, faced with that kind of institutional silence, would have concluded that the problem was too big, that speaking up had already failed, that the smart move was to let it go and protect what they had left. My aunt concluded the opposite. She kept going. She just kept going quietly, on her own time, because she believed that a thing being wrong was reason enough to document it, even if she hadn't figured out yet what to do with the documentation. I think about that when I'm tempted to decide something is too complicated to bother with. The record she built wasn't dramatic. It was spreadsheets and printed emails in a 3-ring binder with a 1-word label on the spine. But it was the thing that made everything else possible. When I brought it to that attorney in Columbus, she said my aunt had done her job for her. 31 years as a paralegal, and my aunt understood exactly what a usable record looked like. She used that knowledge in the one situation where it mattered most, even though she had no guarantee anyone would ever act on it. That's what I mean when I say she was the smartest person in most rooms she walked into, not because she had credentials or because she talked the loudest, because she paid attention, because she thought clearly under pressure without letting anger or frustration short-circuit the process. She knew that an accusation without documentation is just noise, and she refused to make noise. And then there's the part I find hardest to sit with. She did all of it while staying warm. She came to every Thanksgiving. She remembered birthdays. She called me on a random Wednesday when my marriage was struggling and talked for 2 hours without once making me feel like I was a burden. She was holding this the entire time, this years-long private project of building a case against a man who had wronged people who trusted him, and it never made her cold or hard or distant. She just carried it alongside everything else and kept showing up for the people she loved. I don't know how to do that. I'm still learning. But I know what it looks like now, and I know that it's possible, because I watched someone do it for most of my life without realizing what I was watching. The raised beds are still in my mother's backyard. The tomatoes did well last summer.